Thank you, Marco. Let's see that the Old Testament starts just a few years ago. The hopefully provoking title of my talk is a recent allusion to the autobiography of the British pop musician, former lead singer of the band Pulp, Jarvis Cocker. With a twinkle in his eyes, Jarvis Cocker asked if there's a difference between good pop and bad pop. If the answer is yes, who decides the correct classification of these two terms? The musicians, his listeners, or some critics? The same, perhaps with a much more serious attitude, is our task for a perception of public history as political or social activism, and thus aimed at challenges existing power structures. That there is such a close connection between public history and activism seems to be, as yesterday's long discussion has shown, for most of us beyond question. More than 20 years ago, in an editor's corner of the Public Historian, it was in the year 2002, Anne-Marie Plain made a short, a simple, and perhaps a therefore compelling statement, speaking of the real-world involvement of public historians in their communities and the ever-needed discourse about the discipline's self-understanding. She said, "We are active, we are doers, often we are activists." This understanding of activism continues the definition of the public historian for his or her active role, whatever this means in detail. This raises two questions. Are there good and bad forms of activism, and whether and how, and consequently to what extent public historians should engage in activism at all? It is difficult to answer either of these questions without further defining the term itself. That is activism in everyday life and in scholarship, discussing now its disreputable connotations in sharp contrast to genuine true scholarly behavior. In the next few minutes, I would like to point out the speaking of and about political activism in the specific German context is a very difficult task, because there's no clarity about the connotations of activism as good or bad. In addition, I will offer a small set of general reflections on the topic of activism and public history. In the current public debate in Germany, certain forms of activism do not have a good, or at least even a neutral reputation. The reason for this is that activism here stands for a far too close connection to political goals. The much cited climate protests or climate activists are a very recent example of this strong, often very emotional and uncompromising rejection of any kind of activism in the German discussion. One of the main reasons for this may be the German history of the 20th century. Every history has a prehistory. Marco yesterday gave us a deeper insight in the uses of the term activism in the 1920s and 1930s. I will follow up on this more or less directly. In the two totalitarian systems of Nazism and communism, political activism was always something that it was instructed from above. We have an above definition of activism. To put it very, very bluntly, it was, and sometimes still is, associated with brown shirts or blue shirts, with mass meetings or with harvest actions. In sharp contrast, political activism against totalitarian oppressions by historians was and is primarily characterized as some kind of resistance. There's only room here for two very short explanations. First, since the early 1950s, the official title, Verdienter Aktivist, there's no real translation. Let's say, we can say meritorious activist was a state award of the German Democratic Republic in the form of an honorary title, a nice certificate, and a wearable medal. Activists, especially those who met government performance targets in the labor sector, were socialist heroes, and thus suitable propaganda figures for the East German regime. Second point, since the 1980s, German contemporary historians, such as the well-known Martin Brochard, have referred to supporters of the Nazi mass movement as activists, or more precisely as fanatical activists. Moreover, as early as the late 1940s, Allied and German judges had used the term activist, here translated to the German Belasteter, as the second highest category in determining the degree of Nazi involvement of the German population in court proceedings in the immediate post-war period. Other forms of political activism, especially in the 1960s and 70s, went, we have to tell that, astray, to mention only the terrorist German Rote Armee-Fraktion with its very one-sided image of the past. Today, political activism in Germany is closely linked to the peace and environmental movement. In both cases, the roots also can easily be traced in the 60s, 70s, or 1980s. This short, very pointed list shows firstly that talking about activism as a German public historian, it is at least a kind of double-edged sword. And secondly, that activists are not necessarily sympathetic. Even more so, being branded as an activist can mean a dead end for the career hopes of young scholars. The German sociologist Stefan Selke, referring to the field of public sociology, and therefore something similar to public history, expresses this fear in the following words, quote, "The suicide mission between commitment and career, between talent and tenure, has many facets. The fear of being pigeonholed as an activist or a journalist is one of them." Doing history, doing sociology in, for, and with the public without touching on social or political issues seems like wishful thinking. The perception of public history as social or political activism challenged us to confront and discuss the dual heritage of our discipline. Dual heritage in this case is a term used recently by Theodor Kermensky in another editor's corner of the public historian, this time in the year 2021. When he notices public historians have inherited a dual heritage, one that challenges the existing order, but in doing so builds or sustains institutions that preserve a usable past and make it available in the public sphere. Kermensky refers to the point that while institutionalists in their career development, early public historians, and maybe us, every public historian since that point, were activists in some or all of their project in the public and in practice. A contradiction in terms. In some cases, this meant, in Kermensky's words, breaking with an objectionable past and replacing it with one that was consistent with one's own goals, without any negative consequences. One is inclined to say with regard to the suicide mission quoted above for young scholars in the humanities. However, Kermensky does not address another aspect, namely the transition from something like real activism to more passive forms of action. Retrospectives of the peace and environmental movement in Germany, for example, show that the very common path of those once actively involved, in German it was into the state institutions, a way which is sort of a career step. I would like to refer to this as some kind of frozen activism. More than a few histories of public history, especially those of Western origin, confirm this trend. Nevertheless, this development takes place in different countries with a certain lack of time. De facto, what we have talking about the last 2 days is a more or less opposite process. Historians, mostly employed by universities and various other public institutions, are supposed to become activists outside the lecture hall or beyond the classroom, following my suggestion perhaps as a kind of defrosted activism. A lot of national narratives of public history are currently emphasizing their activist movement. If we take the relationship between public history and activism seriously, in the German case, we have a difficult task to solve by finding good arguments why activism by scholars should be different, named the positive case. Can we make sense of the term activism by some kind of redefining it? Instead of political or social activism, humanities scholars tend to speak of civic activism. If we think of civic activism as more than a vast network of anger, there may be a chance to grasp its diverse and multidimensional forms, which may prove relevant to the goals for public history. Following Marco's yesterday's argumentation, we are just shifting the argumentation. I think he's right, but let's have a try. British political scientist Richard Youngs has made such an attempt. He has recently shown that today's civic activism often focus on very local issues and are tightly focused on community aims. This kind of community rootedness seems to be much the same as engaging with history in the international community with history outside the classroom, an aspect that not few in the international community of public historians would call the core or the heart of our discipline and our daily professional life. Civic activism of this kind seeks not so much overt confrontation as indirect workarounds. You can say a middle route between taking on the system and weakly serving it. For Youngs, this middle route means that activists transcend the old opposition between activism checking but ultimately accepting state power and that of emancipatory counter-hegemonic activism. Taking Young seriously, we continue to talk about activism. History and historians should not be at the corner of political disputes or conflicts. That's not, for me personally, is true. Nevertheless, public historians should have a solid understanding of their role in relation to both popular and institutionalized historiography. One viable solution for dealing with the opportunities, risks, and consequences of our dual heritage is the approach of the Belgian historian Antoine de Beets. De Beets, founder and coordinator of the network of concerned historians, has repeatedly addressed the many interrelations between democracy and historical consciousness, as well as democracy and historiography. His slogan is doing responsible history. Nearly 15 years ago, he outlined a current theory of abusive and irresponsible history, on the one hand, and some kind of unscientific, incompetent, meaningless, harmful, and dangerous history on the other. In defining a basic code of ethics for historians, the debates remind us of four irreducible values of our profession: freedom, integrity, respect, and the careful and methodological search for truth. And debates would not deny that responsible history meets with civic engagement. Public historians should not limit themselves to moderating or evaluating the various public communication processes about history. As writers or even doers of history, they have a great responsibility for our present and our future. But this future should be an open future. And the question is, some kinds of activism will, as Marco demonstrated yesterday, not provide an open future, but a future which is illuminated in a very embarrassing way, and it's a fixed future. I would say it's just a fixed future. One solution may be to address collaborators just on issues at the local or regional level. It's the later aspect that promises the greatest impact of public history, since it cannot be successfully advanced without influencing the decision-making processes in one's own social environment. This could also mean working with activists, in the sense I've mentioned above, without necessarily becoming one, in order to gain or to regain lost truths in history as a discipline. Therefore, it is important to explain the historical references that have been identified and researched in a comprehensible way without simplifying them for political goals. None of this means that we should stop looking to history for understanding, support, and help, but it does mean that we should do it with much more care. The strengthening of cooperation and collaboration as civic engagement means remaining in engineering historian context even when working with activists. But this point surely has to be discussed further. Thank you.